Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Lineup Lab. Again, I'm going to show you guys some free tools that I use on Football Outsiders. Actually, tables that I just discovered recently that are cool and have a little bit of fantasy relevance. One or a couple of these tables are going to help us pick defenses. And one of these tables, which we're going to look at now, actually helps to see which offenses and defenses might have been getting lucky or unlucky this season. So basically what this table is, and you can find it on Football Outsiders under the Drive Stats tab, and this table basically shows how many yards per drive a team is getting and how many points per drive a team is getting. And essentially, if we're just talking about the luck aspects of football, you probably say that if a team is getting yards, as long as they're not turning it over or their field position is not terrible, they should probably translate those yards into points. So if someone's yards are high and their points are low, unless it's a really turnover-prone team, it probably means that they're getting unlucky. So we can use this to identify offenses that are kind of, quote-unquote, running bad this season, and maybe see if maybe we're underrating these offenses a bit, maybe underrating the fantasy players in this offense. So I identified a couple teams. One is, and just to show you, so Atlanta this year is number one in offensive yards per drive, also number one in points per drive, and both they're by far. Atlanta's offense has been really, really incredible. Good job by Kyle Shanahan. With obviously the offense strategy is very good because, and I mean, obviously they're a talented team, but wow, this is pretty impressive. The worst team has been San Francisco. Surprise, surprise. They really do not move the ball at all. They also just run read option all the time. So, and are horrible at passing the ball. So this makes sense. Miami's been really bad. The LA Rams are really bad. It all makes sense. So, but here are a couple teams that I think have been running pretty bad with this. One is Chicago. They are 11th in yards per drive this season with 33.6. So that's about 8 yards higher than some of the worst teams. They're definitely middle of the road, a little higher than middle of the road. But they've actually only scored 1.47 points per drive. That's 28th in the NFL. They've actually gotten really unlucky. So unless you think for some reason they are just going to have really bad starting field position because they have a bad, I don't know, special teams or something, or no punt returner, or they're something with defense, or you think they're really turnover prone, which I think Brian Hoyer really hasn't been turnover prone, and I don't think they're really fumble prone, so I'm not sure why. I think they've actually been running really bad in points per drive this season, and I've actually noticed that in the mornings the lines seem to favor Chicago a little bit, so I think the bettors actually are looking at this. I think Chicago's a little better than people think. So what this means is that a lot of the individual players on Chicago probably are underperforming a little bit because they're not scoring as many touchdowns as they really should be. And given that Chicago's pretty decimated on the offensive side, I mean, they basically have 3 wide receivers they play: Alshon Jeffrey, Cameron Meredith, Eddie Royal. They have Zach Miller at tight end, and they have Jordan Howard, who plays 95% of snaps at running back. And so what I would say is your perception of all those players is probably actually a little lower than it should be if you're only gauging this by how they've sort of performed this season. And given that the Bears actually are projected by Las Vegas to score 24.5 points against Jacksonville, and they're at home, I think they're definitely an offense to target in Week 6, and I definitely would not overlook them. Another team that I identified that also seems to be running pretty bad is Cincinnati, and they've been off to a really bad start this season. They're 7th in yards per drive with almost 35 yards per drive, 21st in points per drive. So they're running about as bad as Chicago is. And, they actually have a pretty bad matchup this week against New England. I think they're only projected to score 19 points. However, I will say that their offense is pretty thin as well. I mean, they basically have in the passing game A.J. Green, Brandon LaFell, and Gio Bernard, and that's it. So I honestly would not underrate guys like Green or guys like Bernard in this offense because they're probably running pretty bad in the touchdown department, and that's probably going to improve over the season. So maybe you weren't even thinking about using A.J. Green this week. I think on DraftKings, especially in a PPR format like that, it'd actually be in play or a pretty damn solid play. So we can look at the same thing, looking at defenses, and we can find what defenses have been sort of overperforming and getting lucky this season. Which defenses are allowing a lot of yards but not a lot of points. I also identified 2 defenses here. One is Pittsburgh, who has been allowing 33.6 yards per drive, but only 1.6 points per drive. On top of this, the Steelers just lost one of their best defensive players, Cameron Hayward, for a few weeks, I think, definitely this week. And most people would consider them a good defense, but it looks like they're actually probably a pretty poor defense this season, and they just got a lot worse in their front seven. I think that they're in a matchup with Miami this week. I think Miami is going to be a really underrated offense this week. Again, they're not projected to score that much, but maybe I think as the week goes on and smarter bettors will get on this, and Miami being at home, I think they probably will score more than 20 points. But the big thing here as well is we have them at an estimated 73% pass share. And I think this passing offense actually is pretty decent here. I think guys like Jarvis Landry and Devontae Parker, especially Landry, who probably at a minimum is going to get 7 catches this game, I think that he could be a really good play and probably will be overlooked. And I think Landry's only like 6,900 on FanDuel, or just absurdly priced. So I really actually like Landry specifically in this Miami offense. And I think people are just going to be overrating Pittsburgh as a defense. And another one I saw that I found pretty fascinating was Dallas, who have been allowing a lot of yards per drive, 37, but not a lot of points per drive, only 2. That being said, Dallas runs the ball a lot, and they play slow tempo, which means they're going to keep the opposing offense off the field. So they're just not getting as many drives. But even with that being said, they're running well in the points per drive department. And they do face Green Bay this week. Green Bay is at home. And Green Bay actually has a pretty high run point share. Eddie Lacy practiced. I really don't think that Lacy is a bad play this week. I think he's actually a pretty damn good one, especially if he seems to be like at least 80-90% healthy. So I think that maybe this doesn't feel like that juicy of a matchup, but I actually think, especially for the run game, because that Dallas front seven is not very good, actually is a pretty good one. So I just discovered this table today. Actually, thank you, Nick Yuskevich, one of Daily Fantasy Winners co-founders and writer and video maker, for showing me this, because I think this is really helpful. It's probably these types of stats are what sports bettors look at to sort of evaluate, is this team good, is this team bad? So there's a couple other tables that I look at, and this is mainly for evaluating defenses. And basically, it's Football Outsiders has 2 tables. One is an adjusted sack rate in terms of how well a defense is getting sacks. And then there's one that's adjusted sack rate for how well an offense is protecting against sacks. So one thing that's good about this is it does adjusted sack rate, which means it takes into account how many dropbacks there are. So it's not just like what team's getting sacked the most, because if you just went by that and didn't take into account how many pass drops a team is actually doing, you're not taking into account, well, like if this team drops back 60 times, obviously there's more opportunities for sacks, and that makes a lot more sense. So if we look at this, I think there's a couple of matchups here that probably appear good on the surface, but I actually don't think that they are. And one of them is actually Pittsburgh, which I was just talking about. Pittsburgh is, known as a decent defense. They're against Miami. Pittsburgh's on the road. Pittsburgh, in general, actually has been one of the worst pass rushes in the league this year, only sacking people at a 3.8% rate. They also lost one of their best pass rushers. And so despite the fact that they're facing Miami, and maybe Miami does get sacked quite a bit, they're actually sacked the most in the NFL, I think that they're just not going to be that effective, especially on the road. And I think people are going to overrate this matchup a bit. One matchup that I think people will underrate is Tennessee versus Cleveland. Cleveland actually just lost one of their best offensive linemen, this left guard, and they're already pretty decimated on the offensive line as well. So they're facing Tennessee, who actually has a decent sack rate on defense. They sack teams at about 7.5% clip. And Cleveland, even with a healthy offensive line to start the year, actually gets sacked at a 7% rate. The number is going to raise quite a bit. I would estimate them being bottom 5 in the league. I think this is a fantastic matchup for the Tennessee defense, and one that I think people probably will underrate a little bit. So feel free to look at these tables yourselves. I think they're really, really helpful. I always use this every week for defenses because sometimes you'll have a team that's, projected to run a lot, projected not to get sacked a lot, and people usually end up overusing them. There's not a lot of ones like that this week, but make sure to check this out because, maybe there's a week that someone's facing Oakland, like Seattle or something is facing Oakland and Seattle's at home. And people might use Seattle, but they wouldn't realize, well, wait a second, Oakland actually never, ever gets sacked. And that's probably a bad idea. So there's a lot of little things you can use here. I think this is great for evaluating defenses, and Football Outsiders is a great resource. I recommend going to it and exploring all their tables because they have a lot of cool stuff, and I discover new stuff every week. So I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please click the like button, thumbs up. You can also click subscribe to get updates on my videos, and good luck with Thursday lineups tonight.